Good evening. Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank the New York City Bar Association and its staff. The association is celebrating its 150th anniversary, and though our landmark building is now closed, we are still open as a resource for you. We offer hundreds of free events every year, provide pro bono services to those who can't afford a lawyer, refer lawyers to those who can, and promote legal reform. Videos and podcasts on many topics, including the work of our Rule of Law Task Force, are available on our website. My name is Catherine Lavine, and I am chair of the association's Election Law Committee. Welcome to all of you. You who care so much about our democracy that you have chosen to join us tonight for a discussion about democracy's nuts and bolts, its building blocks, the laws and procedures that govern our elections, and the priorities we should be focusing on for 2021. Thank you for being here. As we have seen over the last few months, our democracy is strong. And the reason it is strong is because of all of us. It is strong because of our legislators and election administrators and election law experts, some of whom are here as speakers and some of whom are in the audience. It is strong because of our co-sponsors, advocacy and professional organizations who work tirelessly for the public good and who are the association's Government Ethics and State Affairs Committee and the association's New York City Affairs Committee, the Advancement Project National Office, Brennan Center, Brooklyn Voters Alliance, Caribbean Attorneys Network, Center for Law and Justice at Medgar Evers College, CUNY, Democracy NYC, Dominican Bar Association, Generation Citizen, Hispanic National Bar Association, Region 2, Latino Justice, PRLDEF, League of Women Voters of New York State, Metropolitan Black Bar Association, Muslim Bar Association of New York, National Bar Association, Region 2, Election Committee, NYPIRG, Reinvent Albany, South Asian Bar Association of New York, and Vote Early NY. But most importantly, our democracy is strong because of you. You know that democracy is not just an idea, it is a process to be protected through our laws and rules and through our votes and our advocacy. You all are, as President-elect Biden said in his speech, the ones who stand watch over our democracy. So thank you once again for everything you do and for being here tonight. A few housekeeping notes. The agenda, you should have received a copy of the agenda with your link. It contains for your consideration the priorities for election reform submitted by our co-sponsors, as well as the full bios of the speakers. A copy will also be put in the chat. The chat will not be open for discussion during the program, but you will be able to use the Q&A to record your comments, and all the comments will be sent to the speakers and co-sponsors for their consideration after the event. And now I would like to introduce you to the moderator of tonight's discussion, Brigid Bergin. Brigid.
Thanks, Catherine. Good evening and welcome to everyone. I'm grateful to be your host tonight for this conversation about issues I spend a lot of time thinking, reporting, and often talking to a lot of you about. First, I want to thank our hosts, the New York City Bar Association, Election Law Committee, and specifically the chair, Catherine Lavine. We've known each other for many years as a part of a small stable of regulars at those New York City Board of Elections meetings. Next, I want to offer a little bit of context as to how I fit into this conversation. Over several years of reporting on the City Board of Elections in particular, I've reported on everything from voter purges to voter registration deadlines to those pesky misprints on thousands of absentee ballots, and to right now the current fight over ranked choice voting. The larger theme to all of this reporting is the administration of democracy here in New York City and New York State. As anyone on this panel will tell you, there are no substantive changes that can be made to the New York City Board of Elections or any county board for that matter, without the work of state leaders, some of whom we are lucky to have here with us on this panel tonight. We're also fortunate, thanks to Catherine's hard work, to have nearly 20 co-sponsors who each provided us with their 3 priorities for election reform. And I'm hoping to tease out thoughts from our panelists on those issues as much as I can tonight. And in the spirit of transparency, I decided to share the 3 items I am most curious about as we move into next year's legislative session. On a national level, we just finished an election where we saw leaders sow doubt and distrust in our electoral system. We continue to see some folks raise questions about the outcome of the election. It took until December 15th for the Senate Majority Leader to acknowledge Joe Biden as the president-elect. While I agree with Catherine that our democracy is strong, I think our panelist, Fernita Tolson, said it well in her podcast, which you should listen to, which I'll paraphrase essentially to say, we were lucky this time. Our democracy is actually fragile, and how we run elections matters. And so the work that you do and the work that all of these panelists do is vitally important. The questions on my mind, what's the status of New York's automatic voter registration bill? It was passed by the legislature. Has the governor asked for the bill yet? What's going on? Will the legislature look at how to professionalize our election administration? And do the panelists believe those kind of changes could prevent the types of snafus we saw in our election this year? And how do we assure voters that their participation in this system matters, is encouraged, and give them faith that our democracy will not buckle under the threat of those who seek to undermine it? Those are some of my big questions for all of you. And here to help me answer those questions and much more are our esteemed panelists. I'm going to do a quick introduction of everyone, and then we're going to go into some presentations. And between each presentation, I might throw a question at the panelists, but I'll hand it off to each speaker. So we have joining us tonight, Doug Kellner, co-chair of the New York State Board of Elections, Jorge Vasquez, Program Director of the Power and Democracy Program at the Advancement Project National Office, Senator Zillner Myrie, Chair of the Senate Election Law Committee, and Assemblymember Charles Lavine, Chair of the Assembly Election Law Committee, Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, I'm going to say that one more time. I apologize, Ciara. Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, a law professor at Stetson University and a Brennan Center Fellow, and Martin Connor, election lawyer, former minority leader of the New York State Senate, and I believe a former chair of this election committee for the New York City Bar Association, as well as Fernita Tolson, the Vice Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and a professor at USC Gould School of Law, and as I mentioned, host of the podcast Free and Fair with Fernita and Foley. It's available on Stitcher. I encourage you to listen. And with that, let's turn it over to Doug Kellner.
Thank you, Brigid, and thank you, Catherine. We start out looking at what we can do to make things better, but I think it's also important to recognize that the last 2 years have changed elections in a very significant manner. When the Democrats took control of the Senate, we were able to enact reforms that the Assembly had been passing for more than a decade, and implemented many significant changes. And we should just reflect on that in the first week of the session, they moved the primary election from September to June. They enacted early voting. They removed a lot of technical barriers to voter registration. And then this year, they did first passage of 2 constitutional amendments, one that would provide for same-day voter registration, and the other that would eliminate the restrictions on voting by mail that are in the state constitution. And then this year with the COVID crisis, we found that one of the solutions was to allow every voter to vote by mail because of the risk of COVID. And so we saw a vast expansion of voting by mail. And these were all great challenges for all election administrators throughout the state. There certainly were some glitches in some places, but overall, we accomplished a tremendous amount in establishing early voting in expanding voting by mail. But there are still many things that do need to be addressed. If you ask me, what are the three biggest priorities for the State Board of Elections this year? One will be implementing automatic voter registration. Hopefully the governor will sign the bill. But there are major improvements to the statewide voter registration database that will make life easier for everybody and anticipate the expansion of voting by mail and same-day voting, which will require a number of administrative changes in order to accomplish them in a way that works well and gives the public confidence that everyone who is eligible to vote is able to vote, and that those who are not eligible will not have their votes counted. Also, we have the new implementation of the public campaign finance system for statewide elections. Now, they don't go into effect until the election cycle for the 2024 elections, but that means we have to have everything ready by June of 2022, and there's a lot of work that has to be done in order to get that ready. And then everyone has seen that New York has to update its canvass procedures, recognizing now that so many more people are voting by mail, that we need to be able to process those votes as they come into the boards of elections and be ready to count those votes so that they can be, so that the public can have meaningful election returns shortly after the close of polls on election day. So those are our three big priorities. Now, in terms of reforms, many of you know that I was a New York City commissioner from 1993 to 2005. My motivation for becoming an elections commissioner was to challenge what the city board was doing to introduce unverifiable new direct recording electronic voting machines. And it was a long struggle, but we succeeded in preventing that from happening. And then when the Help America Vote Act required the New York State to replace its lever voting machines, I was very interested in going to the state board in order to see that we were able to introduce a fully verifiable voting system. And one of the good things about this election is that in New York, no matter what glitches there were at the local level, the bottom line is that we have the paper ballots and we can see how each person voted, and those ballots can be reviewed and audited so that we can be confident in the ultimate count. And Senator Connor may have some remarks when his turn comes about what's going on with the only congressional contest in the country that is still undecided. But the bottom line is that we have the paper and the judge will make decisions. Now, serving 12 years as a New York City commissioner and having to deal with the City Board of Elections as a state commissioner, there are many frustrations. And I certainly support efforts to carefully review how the city board functions and to look for new ways that can improve the processes in the city board. I have three principal gripes. The legislature has already provided authorization for countywide early voting. They've provided authorization to use split shifts for election day workers, and they've provided authorization to run election day poll sites on a much more efficient basis by running them for the whole poll site instead of having separate election districts. And I could go into all the problems for the city board's failure to implement these three things that the legislature has provided for. But the bottom line is that elections would be run better if the city acted on this legislation. And some of the reasons they haven't acted are because of bureaucracy and lack of capability of some of the staff. And the city board is interesting because there are many fine people who work at the City Board of Elections, and they do a great job. But my observation is that 20% of the people do 80% of the work, and that is a problem. So one of the things to look at is whether the current patronage system works. And there are benefits that come from patronage. And certainly when I was a commissioner, I believed in it to the core because it provided for local management of the election system, that I would go to district leaders and the district leaders would put in people from their neighborhoods. But the other side of the coin is we held them accountable. And I was willing to go back to district leaders for people who didn't work out and say, look, we got to remove them. That's not working out. And that was the bargain. I'm afraid that that bargain has broken down in many ways from what I observe now in New York City. And so that's a problem that needs to be addressed. I very much believe in the constitutional provision for bipartisan election administration. It's frustrating. I often have regrets that I have to go back and convince my Republican colleagues to deal with issues. And often it means that the lowest common denominator rules. On the other hand, I have watched systems in other states, and the two options that people talk about, saying we'll have nonpartisan election administration, or we'll have some system of accountable appointees, often doesn't work. It really depends to have. There's really no such thing as an apolitical organization. There's always politics, and the appointing authorities are always going to have the ability to make control. Now, in view of the limited time, let me just make one observation, and that is that the constitutional provision for bipartisan election administration was enacted in 1894. And it actually only requires three things to be bipartisan. It requires qualifying voters, distributing ballots to voters, and counting votes. Those are the only three things that have to be bipartisan under the constitutional rule. Everything else is open. And if you'll go back to how elections were run in 1894, all three of those functions were done at the level of the election district board of inspectors, not by a county board of elections, not by a state board of elections. Indeed, there was no state board of elections until 1974. All of the state functions were run by the Secretary of State, who was usually the head of the political party of the governor.
I'm going to jump in on you soon.
Pardon?
I'm going to jump in on you soon.
Okay, so my bottom line is that what I would suggest is that we go back to the model that New York City had when it was originally formed in 1898, where elections were run on a municipal level, but not by a bipartisan board, but by a city agency. I would change it to have a bipartisan board, 2 citywide commissioners. It'll be up to the legislature to negotiate what the appointment process is for those 2, and they would run all the administrative functions of the board and do it either by civil service or at least eliminate the patronage component where each job within the central city board is assigned to a political party in a particular borough. I would leave the county commissioners for functions that are really important to the county party, and that is ballot access, appointment of the actual poll workers on the local level, and for supervising the canvass.
And thank you.
Thank you, Brigid.
Thank you so much. We're going to keep things moving a little bit because we have to get through the presentations from everyone before we can do my questions. But Doug, you gave, as always, a great history lesson on election law here in New York State. Giving us a more national focus, I'd like to invite Jorge Vasquez to give his presentation. And you know, I will note one of the things that I took away from your comments, Doug, this notion that a nonpartisan entity could not effectively run elections. We have some folks on our panel who are not from New York, so if anyone wants to chime in on that, very interested in your thoughts. Go ahead, Jorge.
Hi, Brigid. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And when I start thinking about New York's reform and what's needed and what's trends around the country, I immediately begin with my story. As a child, I grew up in New York City, born and raised, and like many of my peers in that environment, in that age, the early 80s, early 90s, or mid 80s to the early 90s, our communities were over-policed. And as a result of being over-policed, many of the men in our community, some of them my relatives, my father's formerly incarcerated, by having a felony, were automatically disqualified from participating in the system. And when we think about rights restoration, we often forget of the impact that that has, and particularly in communities of color. So when I start and I talk about rights restoration, I like to talk about it from the perspective of a young Jorge who for a long time thought voting was feminine. And I thought voting was feminine because when I went to vote, and we went to vote as a family, every first Tuesday in November, we were up by 6 in the morning, we were at the polls. It was just my mother, it was my aunts, it was my grandmother, my great grandmother. It was, you know, my neighbors, but it was never my friends' fathers. It was rarely any men in there. And what that did to me was that, without realizing, made me look at voting as something that just men don't do. Fast forward, we find ourselves in a position where thankfully the governor has signed an executive order allowing individuals on parole and probation to vote. But because it's not the law of the state, we still have individuals who just don't know they have the right to vote. Anyone who's canvassed for any candidate, anyone who's been around any community, and you're interacting with individuals who are formerly incarcerated, one of the first things they'll tell you is that I can't vote. Some may know of the executive orders, many do not. And one of the things that we need in New York State, and particularly as it relates to rights restoration, is codifying the executive order to ensure that people who are justice impact, people who have a felony conviction, are able to participate in our democracy. And prior to starting this panel, Catherine and I were talking offline, and I mentioned something to the extent of democracy is a learned experience. And for individuals who look like myself, and understanding New York's history, and particularly around broken windows policing, stop and frisk, and the systemic issues in play, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the collateral consequences on our democracy as it relates to felony conviction and how we treat individuals who have a conviction. Which is why it's important for the governor, as it was noted in the chat, to sign off on automatic voting registration. We are in 2020, 2021 is just a few weeks away from us. There's no reason that New York State is not leading as it relates to voter registration. We are in one of the most diverse states in the country. 1 out of 4 voters are Latinx. We have, if we look at New York City, just Queens alone has hundreds of languages that are spoken. We should have an automatic voter registration so that way we don't have to worry about the technicalities of whether someone properly signed something as it relates to registering to vote or party affiliation and things of that sort. And automatic voter registration would alleviate many of the technicalities that prevent people from engaging in our system. The third, and I'll leave this to Senator Myrie since it's his bill, is to pass the John Lewis Act, New York State's Voting Rights Act with pre-clearance requirements. New York State pulled off what I consider an amazing election this November, and it learned lessons from the June primary. But in looking at the June primary, a lot of things that happened then may have been prevented if we had the Voting Rights Act passed. If we look at the shift from changing sites, if we look at language assistance, even though places like the Lower East Side are covered, Manhattan's covered under Section 203 for Spanish-speaking voters, we saw that some sites still did not have any people who spoke Spanish there to assist New Yorkers who speak Spanish. We see that there are countless organizations within New York City and New York State that the last thing they want to do is have to sue the state and waste resources based on technicalities to ensure that individuals are able to participate in our democracy. And what this bill does, it provides the resources needed so that way individuals aren't expanding themselves and having to go through full litigation just to ensure that the rights that many of us would agree on are upheld. So in short, as we think of our democracy, as we think of the state of New York, I urge that we find a way to ensure that New Yorkers who are of voting age and US citizens to be able to engage in our system. And the 3 points that I like to make, again, are rights restoration, ensuring that people who are formerly incarcerated, justice involved, are eligible to vote, notwithstanding an executive order. 2, that we have automatic voter registration, because we know that individuals who participate in our government, participate in our democracy, generally are more active in their community, and our communities deserve participation. Thirdly is the passage of the New York State Voting Rights Act, so that way we could serve as a model of how states could combat the horrendous decision of Shelby County. And with that said, I'll turn it back over to you. And I invite everyone to check out advancementproject.org/vote. Thank you.
Jorge, thanks so much. Just one quick follow-up question for you. You framed your initial presentation around thinking about a young Jorge and the notion that voting was feminine, which I think is just a really important insight, and I appreciate it. And I wonder what changed and when did it change for you?
I was fortunate that I came from a resilient family. My family was from Puerto Rico. My great-grandmother lived to 111 years old. And I basically learned through my family on the importance of voting. Although my great-grandmother could not read or write, she made her X count. So I learned at an early age going into the, going in when books were books, when levers were levers, and you close it, of what that meant. And what changed for me was seeing the over-policing and then having further discussions and being able to see it from a broader perspective and figuring out how can we create solutions. But unfortunately, there are many people to this day who have that preconceived notion that voting is feminine, or that voting isn't for them because they have a felony conviction, or because they're pro whatever a movement might be, and the individuals who are in that movement may not be eligible to vote because of a felony conviction.
Thank you. I want to invite Assemblymember Charles Lavine to speak to us next.
Thank you, Brigid. And before I begin, Jorge, we have more in common than one might think. My grandmother lived to 106, and she loved to vote, in part because as a little girl, she experienced the worst of privations in Tsarist Russia. And secondly, I had a grandfather who was incarcerated as well. And I'm sure that most of us have had someone in our families who have been incarcerated. And if we all kept that in mind, we'd all be a whole lot better off. All right. I want to thank the Association of the Bar and its Election Law Committee and all the co-sponsors for putting this together. Interestingly enough, reports are out today to the effect that applications for nursing and medical schools are skyrocketing. You'll see where I'm going in just a moment, I hope. At the University of Virginia, medical school applications are up 35% over last year, and its School of Nursing is experiencing a 27% increase, and at Virginia Tech School of Medicine, applications are up nearly 50%. So why is this? The reason is being called the Fauci effect, which is the increased desire to pursue science and medicine to give back to the community in a time of its greatest need. Now, you will be right if you sense that I'm now going to try to pivot to Dr. Fauci's nemesis, his Professor Moriarty, to put this in Holmesian terms. And I'm not talking about Oliver Wendell Holmes, I'm talking about Sherlock Holmes. So more Americans voted in last month's election than ever before. It was nearly 160 million, with Biden winning 81.3 million to Trump's 74.3 million. Now, ironically for the president, Trump's total represented the most votes ever cast for a presidential candidate, with the exception of the total for Biden. So why so many? Well, if there is such a thing as the Fauci effect, then there must certainly be such a phenomenon as the quote unquote Trump effect. That is to say, the increased desire by a substantial majority, that's 7 million in total, of American citizens to pursue monumental political change and to give back to our country in its time of need by casting their ballots for President of the United States, for Joe Biden. I think Trump's comportment, the way he handles himself and his policies, awakened a sense of patriotism in Americans. And to quote the old Joni Mitchell song, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone?" More Americans voted out of a sense of real fear that we would lose the aspirational nature of America, the aspect powered by Lincoln's better angels, if they did not vote, and if Trump was reelected. As a result, the precious right to vote is certainly front and center in the hearts and minds of the American people. Let me share with you my 3 concerns, which are actually 4 concerns, and I suspect you know the 4th already. While other panelists may address macro or more major issues, as chair of the Assembly's Election Law Committee, my concerns, at least the first 3, may be somewhat narrower and perhaps more parochial, but they still matter. First, petitioning. New York is one of the states that requires candidates to procure a substantial number of valid voter signatures in order to have a place on the ballot. Due to the pandemic, the numbers were reduced this cycle. We have to realistically conclude that COVID is not going to be eradicated during the upcoming petitioning cycle. And we need to address how to handle that challenge without exposing those collecting the signatures and those signing the petitions to danger. Number two, voting by mail in New York will be on our ballot in November of 2021 to allow voters to amend our constitution, state constitution, to permit no excuse voting by mail. We will need to have a statewide online capacity for voters to be able to monitor their ballots, their mailed ballots, to make sure that they are received and counted. Because after all, what matters isn't that you get to put an X on a ballot. What matters is your ballot is counted along with everyone else's ballot. Number three, early voting. We need to ensure that there are sufficient early voting locations throughout our state, and we need to develop protocols to allow for votes by mail to be counted expeditiously, which can be done. Number four, no surprise, money. Money. These are expensive propositions. Democracy is expensive, but it's not as expensive as authoritarian states. We need to have the money, and it was truly disappointing that the federal government provided so little funding for New York State and the other states for this election cycle, given that it was a presidential election. It was billions, 4 billion plus were requested. The state of New York ended up getting only 20 million from the federal government. And in order to get that 20 million, we had to spend 4 million that we don't have and didn't have. So money is critically important, and we all know that. Senator Myrie and I will continue to fight, along with all of you in New York and elsewhere, to enact and protect voters' rights, and we will work with all of you to protect that most precious American right. I am going to have to ask you to excuse me a little after 7 p.m. An old friend has passed away. She was ill for a long time. And while I don't know for sure, well, I do know for sure that she was fascinated with government, and I know where her political sympathies lay. I don't know for sure if she got to vote before she passed away. But if I was a betting man, I would bet that she did. So I have a memorial service for her beginning a little after 7. And therefore, I'm going to ask you to excuse me. I really appreciate this opportunity to be here today to express my concerns. And I really appreciate what the Association of the Bar and all the sponsors are doing to promote voting rights in the United States. Because after all, if we don't have voting rights, we don't have any rights. Thank you so much.
Remember, thank you so much. And I'm very sorry about the loss of your friend. To go back to your presentation for just a moment while we have you, I wanted to go back to your first point regarding petitioning, and just ask you to clarify. I mean, part of what I heard you say was an acknowledgement of the fact that this upcoming cycle, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. But what is it that you think needs to be reformed about the petitioning process? Is it the number of signatures required? Is it? Tell me more about what your priority is there.
Thank you, Brigid. I think that we have to focus initially on the number of signatures required. For example, for me to get on a ballot as a member of the New York State Assembly, I need to present to the State Board of Elections 500 valid signatures. Now, in reality, 500 is not going to cut it. It's got to be at least twice that, because there are always some problems with signatures. So what occurred in this last cycle was that, pursuant to order of the governor, The amount of signatures for me were reduced down to, Doug will know for sure, I think it was 130 or something like that. We had already been in the petitioning cycle. I had already been going door to door to get signatures, and realized that the people whose homes I was going to, these are people I know for years, they were hesitant to even want to come to the door to interact. So we will have to do something this cycle to make sure that we're not sending people out to collect signatures and exposing them to danger, and as importantly, exposing those we ask to sign to danger. So one step in the right direction, and this is not to rule out other steps, is to substantially reduce the number of signatures needed to get on a ballot.
Great. Thank you so much. There's much more to talk about there, but I want to continue through our presenters. And next up, we're going to go to Ciara Torres-Spelliscy. Ciara, why don't you take it away?
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, and I'm going to call this talk, Don't Let Corruption Ruin Your Day. So I have been working on the issue of money in politics for 15 years now, and I do that for a few reasons. So number one, I believe that the wealthy do not have a monopoly on wisdom. And in a privately financed electoral system, there's always a risk that the wealthy will try to monopolize politics or monopolize economics or both. Number two, elections are public events. Therefore, voters need transparency around money in politics so that each voter can see who is trying to influence their vote. And thirdly, a corrupt politician can ruin your day, your week, your month, your year, your city, your state, or your nation. And I think campaign finance is the antidote. So one of the things that I do as a professor is I've written a couple of books, and my most recent book was called Political Brands. And one of the things that I dealt with in that book was the disconnect between how justices who sit on the Supreme Court think about corruption as compared to how the average American thinks about corruption. And one of the ways that you can see how the average American thinks about corruption or money in politics is pollsters ask them. And so some of the polling that I used in that book said the following. Gallup found in response to a question, is corruption widespread in the government in this country or not? 75% responded yes. A Chapman University survey of American fears, the top fear was of a corrupt government official. The Harvard Kennedy School conducted a poll of young voters in 2018 and asked them about what is causing existing problems in American politics. And many of those young voters pointed to the issue of money in politics. The New York Times, in their polling, found that 84% of respondents thought that there was too much money in politics. And according to Pew, both liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, by large majorities, favor limits on campaign spending. And they say that the high cost of campaigning is discouraging many good candidates from running for office. And one of the occupational hazards of working on money in politics is I have to spend a lot of my mental energy thinking about corrupt politicians. So in Political Brands, I wrote about some of the corruption that arose out of New York State, including the difficulty in prosecuting Bruno and Skelos and Silver. And one of the things that is making those prosecutions harder and harder and harder is what is happening at the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is narrowing what counts as corruption. And I even think of it as them rebranding corruption. They are really changing the meaning of the word to something that is completely distinct from what the average American thinks. And that has an impact on white collar crime prosecutions. And it also has an impact on which types of campaign finance reforms are even constitutional. And the Robert Supreme Court has deregulated an enormous amount of campaign finance in their short time on the court. But I think it's also important for us to realize as reformers that broad parts of campaign finance law are still perfectly constitutional. So for example, disclosure of money in politics, including on-ad disclaimers, are still fully constitutional. Contribution limits on individuals who give money to candidates, that is fully constitutional. Contribution limits on corporations who give to candidates, that is still constitutional. And voluntary public financing is fully constitutional. And I have always been very passionate about New York and New York City. I lived there for over a decade, and my father is also a New Yorker. And one of the things I did when I was a lawyer at the Brennan Center is I wrote a piece called What Albany Could Learn from New York City, a model of meaningful campaign finance reform in action. That was 12 years ago, and I'm happy to report that both New York City and New York State over those 12 years improved their campaign finance. But I think there's still more work to do, especially at the New York State level. So I would suggest that New York should lower its exceptionally high contribution limits, which allow individuals to give as much as $69,700 to a candidate for statewide office. Also, New York State should enact pay-to-play limits by reducing or limiting contributions from government contractors in particular. In the area of public financing, I think the main thing that could be done right now is that Governor Cuomo and legislative Republicans need to appoint commissioners to the new Public Financing Commission. The Democrats in the legislature have already appointed their seats. And moreover, as I think a previous speaker spoke to, the state needs to fund this innovative new public financing system. It needs to be ginned up now so that it works in the 2024 election. I realize that budgets are tight, but we need to invest in our democracy. I think if I learned anything over the past 4 years is to not take our democracy for granted. So to sum up my top three, number one, lower contribution limits overall and lower contributions for state contractors in particular. This will lessen the ability of the wealthy to monopolize New York State politics. Number two, since elections are public affairs, provide transparency of who is funding campaigns by including top donors in disclaimers that are on ad, whether they are from candidates or from outside spenders. And number three, prevent corrupt politicians from ruining your day. Invest in small donor public financing so that there is a real alternative to the privately financed elections in New York State. Thank you so much.
Ooh, Ciara, there is so much there to dig into. We could have a whole other conversation just on campaign finance, but for now, since you spent so much time looking at this information, presumably you've seen places that do it better. And so a couple follow-up questions. When you talk about lowering contribution limits, is there an average that you've seen in other places that do this better? And are there states that make this information? I mean, if you've ever tried to find information on the New York State Board of Elections website through their campaign finance portal, as Doug well knows, it is not necessarily an easy task. However, in New York City, the city's campaign finance board serves up that information in a much easier and much more user-friendly format. So with that aside, are there other states that do it better? are there limits that seem to work?
So one of the studies that I did while I was an attorney at the Brennan Center is we looked at the impact of low contribution limits on the competitiveness of elections. That was inspired by the Randall versus Sorrell case at the Supreme Court, where they knocked out Vermont's contribution limits as being unconstitutionally low because they would impact the competitiveness of races. And one of the things that we found is actually the lower the contribution limits, the more competitive state house races were. So we looked at, I think, 25 states, if I can remember correctly, and that was the impact. Now, of course, New York is a expensive place to run an election, in part because of the expensive media markets in New York. And so what I would encourage the lawmakers who are on the panel to do is have legislative hearings and listen to people who run campaigns and how much it costs to get out messages, especially if they're using broadcast advertising, and then calibrate the contribution limits so that you could still run a competitive election, a competitive race as a candidate with that new contribution limit. So I don't think there's a magic number, but I think you definitely need a legislative history that considers that question, because inevitably the James Bopps of the world, he's the guy who did Citizens United, will come, and no matter what you do, no matter how careful you have been, he will come and litigate. But the way that you defend those limits is by showing that the legislature was thoughtful when it implemented those limits. And in terms of disclosure, the only thing I would warn against is against first dollar disclosure. So someone just spends $5 on an election and then suddenly they have to disclose under the campaign finance system. Think about when the disclosure threshold kicks in and make it so that you are catching the whales and not the minnows.
I love that. I also like the idea of not letting a corrupt politician ruin my day. Though I will say, when it happens late in the day and I have to write a story about it, that can ruin my day. Thank you so much, Char. There's more, but we'll keep moving and we'll come back to folks for some follow-up questions. Let me, next on the agenda, we have Marty Connor. Are you there?
I'll just mention Marty is in the midst
I'm
of
unmuted.
litigation.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything going on in your world these days?
A lot, but let me comment on some things while the professor's here. Everybody's thinking the worry about money in politics is something that's developed in the last couple of decades. And people may be interested to know that there was an uproar in New York State about the undue influence of money in elections, and the legislature acted. In 1820, it passed a law saying no one can contribute money to a campaign, or a candidate could spend any money for other than printing ballots, because of course the parties printed the ballots then to drop in the ballot box, newspaper ads, and handbills. You say, what about the First Amendment? Well, the First Amendment didn't apply to New York until like 14 or something, in a Supreme Court case through the 15th Amendment. So there was a concern about the undue influence of money for a long, long time. And when I first ran for office, I remember I raised the enormous amount of $2,000 to spend for a state Senate race. The last time I ran, I raised $450,000. My opponent raised over $1 million. He beat me. What you do about it, I don't know. I think public financing is the way to go. But you got to invest in that. You got to put staff in. And we'll get to my next point. And in the race I'm involved in now representing Congressman Brindisi, the last contest in America to be decided. The court found last week that all 8 county boards of elections in the district had failed to properly canvass votes according to the statute. So everybody criticizes the New York City board, and certainly there are some things there that could change and get better, but they're one of the best boards in the state, yet all the interest groups and press, et cetera, focus on the city board of elections. The fact is the average board of elections, probably a majority of the counties in the state, consist of 4 people, 2 commissioners and 2 deputies. That's it. They are at the mercy of their local board of supervisors or county government for their budget, and nobody invests in them. And if you go back to when Spitzer was governor and I was designated for my conference to negotiate a change where everybody would file with the state board of elections their campaign finance information, I raised the question, well, this will put a lot more work on the state board of election. And the answer was, oh, well, we'll put money in the budget. And they put a dry appropriation, and I think it was 20 million bucks, more of 10 million for the state board, because they would be picking up 12,000 more filers, I think was the number. The next year, tight fiscal time, Governor Patterson cut it out of the budget. They've never gotten that money, but they got the 12,000 filers, and people say, whoa, why don't they follow up and chase everybody who fails to file and all? The answer is staff. People don't realize, for all the criticism in New York City Board of Elections, because of COVID, they operated leading up to the primary with 75 employees at work versus the 295 that worked there. Anybody with a lot of experience was older. A lot of them had pre-existing health conditions, and they were all kept home. And elections administration work is not something you can do very well remotely. You're dealing with pieces of paper that come flying in and absentee ballots and applications and so on. So I think we have to put things in perspective. You have to pay. You have to pay to get good election administration. One of the county boards we're dealing with up there, one of the larger ones, Broome County, when the judge asked where the commissioners were, the deputy commissioner said, oh, they're never here. They weren't involved in the canvass. They're 2 part-time lawyers, one Republican, one Democrat. The deputies actually make more. Some of these county boards pay the commissioner $28,000 a year, and you wonder why they don't get it right. So if you talk about professionalizing boards of elections, I have some questions. First of all, I kind of agree with Doug. What's a nonpartisan? Everybody has a view. I mean, a true nonpartisan to me is somebody who's not paying any attention and doesn't give a damn about what's going on in the state or the country. But secondly, and maybe I just don't know, where are the masters in election administration programs going on? There are all kinds of master's programs for all kinds of other kinds of business administration, this, that, and the other thing. If you're talking about, and I think some universities, once we're over this crisis, would be well advised to think about starting those kind of programs. If you're going to have a core of professional election administrators, you know, all the ones I know, and there are some very good ones across the country, they learned on the job. You know, there's no real training thing. That said, bipartisan supervision of the actual counting of votes and so on, I think, is a safeguard for the public. It should instill confidence in the public. You know, for all the noise that we're hearing about the national election, the bottom line is most of those votes that a certain party's partisans or leader is saying, oh, we're fraudulent, they were counted by a team that included Republican. Yeah. So what are we talking about? So funding, number one, it's not sexy. The Board of Elections, there are all kinds of constituency groups. Believe me, in 31 years in the state Senate, people came, oh my gosh, you got to fund this, you got to fund that. And as I'm sure Senator Myrie and Assemblyman Lavine know, you know, you don't get a big constituency writing letters, sending petitions, and knocking on your door saying more money for election administration. But the fact is, and all the great reforms that have happened in the last couple of years put more work on boards of elections, and the ones that happened this year because of COVID, you know, just dumped a ton of work on them, when in fact, the large board of elections were under a mandate to leave at least half of their employees at home because of COVID. So I think we came through pretty well. But I also would urge all the people who focus on election reform, who keep focusing on New York City and sometimes the large suburban counties, look at the rest of the state. Look at the rest of the state, because if we were ever in a situation where a handful of votes determined a New York statewide election, or an election where New York's electoral votes are going to go, a vote in Tioga County is equal to a vote in Queens County. And believe me, and in fact, the judge in the case we're doing now said the message should go out to all counties, from Erie to Ulster to Suffolk. They should be conducting these canvasses according to law, and they weren't. They developed things like, oh, they don't write the protest on the envelope to preserve it for court or the ballot. They put stickies on. The stickies fall off. Well, it's how we always did it. When we first heard a county testimony that that's how they did it, I thought, oh, that county's messed up. Then when we heard from 3 or 4 more counties, we found out that's how they all do it. Not the statute. It doesn't preserve the record properly. Then we had testimony of, oh, they handed stacks of absentee or affidavit ballots to the candidates' representatives, who, by the way, were innocent. They go there and the commissioners say, here's what we're going to do. And they hand them a stack of ballots and say, go through them and see if you got a problem with any of them. The judge was like, actually confessed that he had done election law cases before he was a judge, Oswego County. He said, I never touched a ballot or an envelope. You're not supposed to do that. You know, only sworn election officials do that. And apparently we have these, and in my experience, some judges go along with this. You know, oh yeah, they'll decide whatever when they don't really have the authority to do it. So, and my answer to that is, while the regulations and the statutes say the state board of elections has supervisory authority over the county board of elections, in practice, and I think Doug will say this, in practice, there's never been bipartisan agreement that they should exercise any real hands-on supervisory role. They send guidances. They conduct for county board of elections commissioners at their annual meeting when they all get together. They have training sessions about how to canvass votes and what you're supposed to do. But they don't have the staff. They don't have the funding to be real supervisors. And, you know, some of the testimony in the case we're doing now was horrifying, but I'm afraid it's typical of what a lot of county boards of elections are doing, because they're not under the same kind of scrutiny that like the New York City Board of Elections is. And, you know, the city board takes a lot of hits, but in my experience, they actually get it right. They should be getting it right 100% of the time. They get it right now 90% of the time. I'm telling you, there are boards around this state that don't get it right 10% of the time. And I think we have a statewide problem, Assemblyman, Senator. And the answer, I think, is to give the state board the kind of resources that they can actually supervise, you know, what these county boards are doing and enforce upon them what they should do. You know, one little suggestion for tweaking the law. Somebody mentioned, you know, I'm sorry to hear this, the loss of a friend. Right now, as we expand early voting, and I don't know how it works with early voting, but New York law up until now has said that somebody who sends in an absentee ballot, drops it in the mail, and dies before election day The absentee ballot's no good. You have to be alive on election day. Now, I say, I don't know how that would possibly work with early voting. People are going in 2 weeks before the election and voting. So I think maybe a little clarification in the statute that if you're alive when you cast the vote, whether it's an absentee or early vote or whatever, it counts. You know, the legislature keeps changing things, but there are these little details that get lost, because who would know that? Except I've been in counts, and actually where we are now in this Brindisi thing, there are 3 voters.
I'm going to
There
jump.
were obituaries. Pardon?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to jump in because I want to ask you one follow-up, but we still have presentations from Senator Myrie and Professor Tolson that I'm very excited about. My quick follow-up to you, you know, as someone so steeped in election law, it's a somewhat simplistic question, but I think all the examples that you just laid out for us in terms of the complexity of a system that is not centralized, that is administered at a local level, at varying degrees of sophistication and support, with a body of law that is several inches thick. Is New York State election law just too complicated? Could we streamline some of the rules and the statutes that govern elections to allow for them to be administered more effectively?
Well, I think the law, in a lot of respects, is appropriately detailed on exactly how every board is supposed to deal with ballots and the process of counting them and giving candidates the opportunity, you know, transparency, and you can protest and preserve it for court. I really think, though, the whole statute needs to be overhauled, because there are things, for example, there were consequences of shifting to a June primary from a September primary in terms of time limits for starting different court proceedings and so on. There were all, when we went to, and I was in the legislature and insisted that we have the paper trail, and I would ask the legislators why you passed the manual audit hand count bill and made it effective January 1st. Now what, 16 days from now, 15 days from now? And you said, oh, it's important to count all the ballots, so you have to do a hand count if there's a 0.5% margin. We are now currently in this Brindisi, Claudia Tenney race at 0.001%, not 0.1%, 0.001%. Out of 318,000 votes counted, there's a 12-vote margin. We don't get a hand count. We don't get a hand count based on what I think is a faulty court precedent that was set when these machines were new, and I don't think the Court of Appeals or the courts really understood. But we don't get a hand count, and it's far, far closer to the law you passed. A lot of the laws you passed in July, effective immediately, I thought were great. You know, the definition of substantial compliance for affidavit ballots and all, and empowered voters and made their votes real. I really don't know why that needed a delayed effective date. You know,
Senator, thank you.
somebody maybe can answer that for me.
Well, which is a good segue
But just one other thing, Bridget. There are other things in there, moving to a June primary and then keeping independent nominating petitioning before the June primary made no sense. Historically, it was always in the summer because it's for the general. Just moved back because, it always came right party petitioning. Yeah, it did when you had a September primary. It had to. Doesn't have to anymore. So I would urge there's a lot that could be revamped in the election law. It's either not applicable or doesn't work anymore under the current way we vote.
Thank you. I want to go to Senator Myrie, Chair of the Senate Election Committee, member of the supermajority of Democrats that now control the state Senate. What's coming? What are your reform priorities?
Thank you, Brigid. And of course, thank you to the New York City Bar Association, to Chair Lavine, very esteemed panel that we are on. I think a lot of the things that we care deeply about have been mentioned. But I want to say it's really tough to pick three things. In the past 2 years, along with my excellent co-chair in the Assembly, we've made upwards of 60 changes to the election law. And I suspect that we will keep at that clip in the next session, both for things big and small. But I want to frame the conversation in a civil rights context. When I assumed the chairmanship of the Elections Committee, my pledge was to take New York from worst to first. And what I meant by that was really, we have some of the worst voter participation rates in the entire country. And as someone who was born and raised in New York, that is an embarrassment, frankly. We deserve a world-class democracy, one in which voters engage with ease and accessibility. And up until this point, that has not been the case. What we saw in this past general election is when we do make it easier to vote, we give folks more options, more days to vote, more ways to vote. Guess what happens? People vote more. It is a pretty straightforward proposition, and one that I remain very committed to. A big piece of this is what Jorge mentioned at the top of the program. When the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, it has been heralded as the most important piece of civil rights legislation in this country's history. And that is not hyperbole. That has been the wide consensus. And that is because voting is the right that protects every other right. And if we do not do that for the most vulnerable among us, if we don't do that for communities that have been historically disenfranchised, then we are not just denying them the ability to mark off a candidate, we are denying them a say in how their housing is built, in how their education is administered, and how their social services are provided. It is at the root of everything that we do in this country. And so what we saw in 2013 with the gutting of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act and the subsequent gerrymandering, voter suppression, voter dilution, voter intimidation, a lot of us here in New York has said, this is something that happens in the South. This is not a New York problem. Here in New York, we are a bastion of progressivism. We are the capital of the progressive world. But voter suppression, dilution, intimidation happens right here in New York. And because we don't have the federal protection, we thought it was incredibly important that we step up as a state and pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York. It is a bill that I've introduced. I've worked with a lot of the folks that you've heard from tonight. And what it would do is work on all of these protections for voters. And so in addition to having a pre-clearance mechanism that would have the New York State Attorney General pre-clear any election changes that would affect covered communities, we'd also work to have language accessibility. We'd also work to ensure that the mode in which people are elected, whether that is a district-based election or another mechanism, doesn't dilute the vote of people of color. It would also consolidate some of our elections. Many of you know we have town and village elections that happen on off years and off months, happening in February, in March, in May, where the participation is really low. This would give you a right of action against voter intimidation and voter dilution and voter suppression. And it would also require data. Anyone who is steeped in election law knows that what would really help with the administration of our elections is having enough data and being transparent about it. And so this is one of my top priorities for the next legislative session. We are proud to have support from a wide array of organizations, many of whom have co-sponsored tonight's event. And it's something that I'm really proud to sponsor and push for, primarily because of what it would do, but also what it would stand for. That in New York, we are leading the way in the absence of federal action. We are stepping up and protecting our voters. You know, it's also important to me, many folks who are familiar with my work know I care very much about reforms to our criminal legal system. So the restoration of rights for those who have been justice involved is something that I care deeply about, and that I'm also going to be pushing in the next legislative session. And you know, I think about all of the things that have been mentioned by our previous speakers regarding the actual administration of our elections. We got to do better on absentee ballot counting. There are creative ways for us to start this earlier. You can imagine a scenario in which the presidential election hinged on New York counting their votes, and what a source of national scandal it would have been if we had to wait for us to finish our absentee ballot counting. So we're going to be looking at ways to fix that process. Early voting was a huge success. I was very proud to sponsor that bill. That's something that they had been passing in the assembly year after year after year. We were able to get it across the finish line. We saw many New Yorkers take advantage of it. And it was exciting on day one to see how long the lines were. On day two, also exciting. Day three started to be a little less exciting. And day 4 and 5, when the lines were still incredibly long, we started to see that there were problems in how we administered this successful program. So we're going to be looking at how to revamp that. We need more polling sites. We need a better formula in how we allocate them to registered voters. And I think there are other opportunities for us to, I think, have a frank discussion about what reforms, if any, are required to the structure of the Board of Elections. You heard some of these ideas from some of our previous speakers. I intend to have a hearing on this next session so that we can have all the stakeholders to the table. You know, it's not an easy thing to tackle. This is, I think the current structure was born out of a desire for sincere checks and balances, but it is a structure that perhaps can use some tweaking or reforming. And I think that we should start to have that discussion as policymakers. And so I'm incredibly excited about what's on the horizon for next session. I've been very excited to be the chair of the Elections Committee. We've done, I think about the number of hearings that we have done, myself and Chair Lavine, after every election. And then we've gone back to the legislature, we've made changes, we've seen how it's executed, and then we have another hearing and do the same thing. And it's an iterative process that I hope to continue. And so again, I'm really appreciative to be with everyone tonight, and I look forward to folks' questions.
Senator, thank you so much. I want to ask just a couple follow-up questions on the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. Some of the provisions you mentioned, and just so you know, just so that folks understand kind of how it would work. When you talk, first of all, you talked about the need for data and how that would be helpful. What data in particular are you talking about?
You know, so I think people would be shocked about the lack of information that we have about voters, right? And this is all, of course, respecting people's privacy and not violating anyone's, sacred right to vote in private. But there are things, if you look at early voting, for instance, the boards of elections have the numbers of who checks in and what time that happens, from what election district they were given. They have that almost instantaneously. But when it comes to disseminating that in a format that is able to be manipulated by folks who study this or who may be using it for to see where the holes were, to see, okay, how many people came in from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. As opposed to 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Perhaps there's a way for us to change the resource allocation, because we know that in the afternoon, there are more people coming, right? It's little things like that. There's some demographic data that I think would be important. We don't have that currently. If you talk to folks who do campaigns, there's a lot of guessing based on surnames. on where folks are from, which is of course an imperfect process. And I think for purposes of determining whether or not a community has been disenfranchised, having some of that demographical data, I think will help us to reach those communities as well. And so, this particular provision would entrust our state university system to appoint a data director who would be charged with collecting this information and making it available to the public.
And when you talked about not wanting to dilute the votes of people of color, was it in specific elections or specific districts? Does that involve changing how districts are drawn? Just, I want to clarify what you were.
Yeah, so it involves a number of those things, Brigid, and some of the folks on this panel have worked on some of these litigations where you have communities of color here in New York. Largely, I'm thinking more recently about what has happened down in Long Island, where at-large district elections really prevent communities of color from electing an individual that looks like them. And so there are ways that have been implemented in other states where if you change the at-large system to a district-based system where communities of color can vote together, that often increases the representation of folks that look like them. California has a state voting rights act, and there was a UCLA study done to examine how many elected officials of color were elected in local elections post passage, and the professors concluded that it did increase this sort of representation. And I would, shamelessly plug that both of those professors have supported our Voting Rights Act bill, and so I think it's something that's worth our consideration.
Great. And one final question, and then we will get to our final presenter. There's been a lot of conversation tonight about how to overhaul or how to reimagine the Board of Elections. And we've talked about nonpartisan and whether or not a nonpartisan entity could administer an election. Given that you're about to hold a hearing about some of these issues, I wonder if some of what we're talking about is maybe professionalizing or modernizing the Board of Elections, because as we've talked about, many of these systems that you need to be able to implement some of these other reforms rely on data, which relies on use of technology. How much of that will you be looking at in your hearing?
Yeah, I think everything should be on the table. I think that this is such a gargantuan task, and one that is, I think everyone would readily admit, is not an easy lift. I think that we should be hearing from all stakeholders and all interested parties. On the professionalization front, I think it is, and we've heard some of this tonight, very regionally based. When you look at the pay rates, for instance, of folks who work at the Board of Elections here in the city and outside of the city, you see some pretty drastic disparities. But I'm actually an advocate for paying our election workers more. With the old adage of you get what you pay for, I think holds true. And I think it's important for us to consider, when we're having a discussion around professionalization, like everyone has said, how much resources we're ready to invest. As far as reimagining and discussing reform, again, I think it's important that we hear from everyone, and I don't dismiss any proposal or any sort of approach out of hand, because it's important, certainly in the legislative process, for us to hear from as many people as possible. I think I'm very wary of anyone saying definitively that this is the solution, because many times we create solutions and create attending problems as well, and it's not an easy thing. You pull one lever and something else pops out. But I'm really looking forward to hearing from as many folks as possible, because I think at the end of the day, most voters are not like the hundreds of people that have joined us tonight, right? And the panelists, we love this stuff. We consume it. We're all like dweebs about this, but the everyday voter doesn't care. They want to be able to go in, vote, and then carry on with their business. And I think it's incumbent on all of us who are influencing that conversation to make that process as easy as possible, however we get there.
Thank you so much, Senator. And I want to thank our final presenter, Vice Dean and Professor Franita Tolson from USC Gould School of Law, also host of her own podcast, which I am recently a subscriber to. Professor Tolson, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Brigid. I'm very happy to be here. So I think I want to spend my time offering a full-throated endorsement of many of the proposals offered by the participating organizations. I think these proposals can alter New York's voting system so that it works better for voters. Now, this is, of course, not to take away from the strides and the progress that have been made in recent years, but I'm greedy and I want more. Here's why. Often lost in this narrative about reform and change is that election administration is not supposed to be in service of politicians. Instead, it's about facilitating the voting process for individuals to best translate politics into policy through elected officials endorsed by the actual electorate, and not an electorate whose composition is constrained by artificial barriers. For this reason, any reform project should center the voters as its focal point. And I believe many of the proposals do exactly that. After all, our system is premised on consent of the governed, and part of election reform, particularly after the year we've had, has to be about restoring the faith of voters in the system. And you don't do that by making voting needlessly hard or by needlessly disenfranchising portions of the population. So in terms of the proposals that I endorse, first would be easing registration restrictions through some variation of automatic voter registration, same-day registration, or completely online voter registration. So the proposals advocated by the Advancement Project, the Brennan Center, and other participants. And part of the reason this is important is because we're conditioned to think that voter registration is a normal part of becoming a voter, because it does serve an important administrative function. But we have ignored that voter registration can be, and indeed has been, a voter suppression tactic in some circumstances. During Reconstruction, for example, Southern states had very onerous requirements to prevent Black people from voting, often requesting names, date of birth, and address information that these voters did not have because many were born in slavery and or resided in homes that did not have official addresses. So it was an artificial barrier in that circumstance designed to be suppressive. And I think the goal has to be to prevent voter registration from functioning in that way again and staying true to its true administrative function. So automatic voter registration and allowing people to update their information online or same day or reforms that can be implemented as evidenced by the bill currently before the governor. New York does not need 25 days to verify that people are who they say they are. And so they can join 19 states plus the District of Columbia, states that have enacted automatic voter registration. The second is the passage of the New York State Voting Rights Act with the preclearance provision. So as Senator Myrie mentioned, this law would be potentially transformational, right? Especially after the Supreme Court gutted the preclearance provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act. So the possibility of having state level voting rights acts can provide a path forward for addressing the gaps that now exist and actually that have existed in the federal scheme, because the Federal Voting Rights Act also was not perfect. As he mentioned, California has its own Voting Rights Act, and I'm in California, so I've been able to see that it has made a difference in our system. Under California law, the law prohibits the use of any election system, quote, that impairs the ability of a protected class to elect candidates of its choice or its ability to influence the outcome of an election, end quote. So under the act, jurisdictions have been sued for electing their governing bodies using at-large or mixed election systems that dilute the political power of racial minorities. California enacted their Voting Rights Act in 2002, so it actually existed alongside its federal counterpart. So it was able to protect the rights of racial minorities in instances where federal law would have failed to do so. So in many ways, it was a complement to the Federal Voting Rights Act. So New York has an opportunity to follow suit here. right? It can enact the voting rights proposal and allow plaintiffs to demand that jurisdictions take special steps to protect minorities, especially where there's racially polarized voting, which is not a Southern phenomenon. It very much exists in Northern states. And it can do so without making burdensome demands of plaintiffs that sometimes are required under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so in that way, it can enhance voting protections for minority groups. The law could also punish jurisdictions that have poor records in this area, similar to the preclearance provisions that used to exist under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And finally, so I put all of this under the umbrella of promoting access. So the expansion of early voting, having a public education campaign of sorts for voters, adding polling places to college campuses, and also rights restoration. So all under the broad umbrella of promoting access. And these proposals were suggested by numerous organizations. They're all really, really important and really, really vital. And even more importantly, they are something that can be accomplished. So this year we had historic turnout, right? So north of 150 million people participated in our election. So that's a good thing, but it also had the benefit of exposing many of the gaps in our system, right? Things that we can fix and address and learn from. And one of the important lessons is that we live in a world of disinformation and misinformation, which means that voter education and transparency have become extremely important. How important? Well, the election was November 3rd. Vice President-elect Biden won Pennsylvania 4 days later, effectively winning the election. Yet tens of millions of people think that the election is still ongoing because there's a fundamental misunderstanding about how our system works. Misinformation fills the void where knowledge should be. Also important, there were a number of down ballot and state and local races that didn't get sufficient attention because people don't understand their import. Right, what we are facing is a crisis of civic education that is threatening our system of democracy. This crisis is exacerbated because of artificial constraints on access as well. So expanding early voting to more location and days, and making no excuse absentee voting permanent are all ways to signal the state's commitment to democracy. Voting should not be hard. And these are all reforms that exist in other states that have not imploded by making access easier. Finally, it is important to have legislation securing the right to vote of those with felony convictions. So much of the state felon disenfranchisement regimes nationwide have gotten away from their original premise of punishing those who have broken the social contract to effectively function as a regime of exclusion, particularly for Black and Brown people, in which those who have made mistakes can never overcome their error. New York law should not create a permanent underclass and should be designed to affirmatively facilitate the return of these citizens back into the political community rather than keeping them out indefinitely. In addition to legislation that will make the governor's executive order permanent, these steps could include automatically registering these individuals to vote upon release. And it could also mean that failure to pay fines and fees should never be a barrier to registration, which was a especially painful lesson that we learned after the attempt to re-enfranchise those with felony convictions in Florida in the past year. So I think that's something that New York can also take away in thinking about what voting rights for that particular demographic could look like. Okay, thank you. Back to you, Brigid.
Thank you so much, Professor Tolson. I want to, again, a lot of great comments there, but I want to take advantage of your perspective being in California, looking at New York from that vantage point, and seeing us as a state that is run by a cadre of blue leaders. When you were speaking with your colleague Ned Foley, you described New York as notorious, but you weren't saying it in the best way. So given the fact that the state, despite the fact that it is run by Democrats, why do we appear notorious when it comes to how we administer our elections to someone from the other side of the country?
So I will also, in the interest of fairness, say that California is not free of our election mistakes either, right? It's just that, a lot of this is about political gain. And so it's not a Republican or Democratic thing necessarily, it's a politician thing, right? There's something seductive about trying to ensure that you are insulated from competition when you run for election. And so because of that, that affects the rules of the game. Nationwide, we have the foxes guarding the hen houses, with apologies to Senator Myrie and Assemblyman Lavine. But it's true, right? We have the elected officials laying out the rules of the game, right? And because of that, the focus, we lose sight of the fact that this is supposed to be about the voters. And so I'm hoping that part of the move going into 2021 and subsequent election cycles is that we reorient to focusing on what voters need in order to make sure their preferences are being heard. And so New York is notorious in part because they make it hard for people to vote. At least, there have been changes. I don't want to negate that. They make it hard. They make it needlessly hard for people to vote. And part of it is about incumbency. But they also make it hard to get on the ballot. Assemblyman Lavine mentioned the petition requirements. That when I was speaking about New York being notorious, I was thinking about a 2000 election case that had to do with John McCain trying to get on the ballot during the presidential election and having trouble in New York of all places. And I remember the first time I read that case, I was like, New York, right? But New York is not insulated from that same desire for those who are in office to maintain control. And so I'm hoping that we can, this is a moment where we've seen our democracy. We basically got through the past election cycle with the skin on our teeth, right? We did it, but we were lucky. And I'm hoping that we look back and we reflect and realize that we have to make some changes, and it needs to start with putting the voters first.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have time left to go through some questions, which is great for me, since I have lots of questions for all of you. I still see Senator Myrie there, and I think Assemblymember Lavine is not with us anymore, but I will put this question to Senator Myrie and to some extent to Commissioner Kellner. Can you tell us more about the status of AVR and where we are and when we might see the governor sign it? And if he does, is the state ready to begin doing what it needs to do to implement it?
Yeah, so I wish I had more to report on this front. There's no new developments. I think we're still sort of trying to figure out how to get it to the governor's desk. I think as far as preparations, I think the state will be ready. I think they are continuing as if this will be signed, and frankly, I think some of the infrastructure has already been there, and they're starting to set it up. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to be able to get this done. And I'm hopeful that will happen sooner rather than later. The advantage to having this conversation on December 15th or 16th, whatever day it is that there's not that much time left. So we're going to know sooner or later whether we'll get some movement. But I feel good, and I think that the state will be ready.
Since you are on my screen, Senator Myrie, I'm going to ask you another question, again, about your Voting Rights Act here in New York. We did see some, we'll call them snafus in this year's election, whether it was too many voters assigned to an early voting site, or when it comes to some of what we saw with absentee ballots, ballots, the people applying for them late, ballots not reaching the voters, ballots then reaching the voters and not reaching the Board of Elections. I'm wondering, would pre-clearance help in any of these issues, and which issues would it help address?
One of the, I think, most effective tools of pre-clearance was that it motivated local boards of elections to do things the right way the first time, in order to not have to go through the pre-clearance process. And so it was really meant to encourage the boards to do things correctly. And I imagine that having a local pre-clearance would have the same effect. And part of what we see with the boards of elections, there's some things that are based on incompetence, and some things that are just based on inefficiencies in the system. But I think by and large, that there are good intentioned folks who want to see the voters be able to participate in their democracy. But to some of the earlier points, there's not enough accountability. And pre-clearance is about accountability when you do mess up or when you do things that disenfranchise communities. So my hope, the technical answer to that is we sort of delineate a number of things that may constitute something that falls into the pre-clearance category, but there's a catch-all provision in the beginning of the bill that says the interpretation of the election law is in presumption of the voter, in that whatever helps them to carry out the franchise or allows them to register to vote, gives them accessibility to the franchise, that is how we should interpret the law, the regulations, and the practices of the boards of elections. And that provision is meant to set the tone early and to really express to all of the local boards that you should be doing everything possible to make it easy for the voter.
Thanks, Senator. Jorge, I want to go back to your priority in terms of rights restoration, and really, can you talk about what it will take or what work is being done that you're part of to codify the governor's executive order? We know that's in place, but do you envision a path to permanence?
So one of the things that we're doing at Advancement Projects National Office is that we're meeting year round with elected officials, with communities, and everything being community centered, and training organizations on just how elections work, because we know that many times incidents that happen on election day or during early voting could be prevented if individuals are in communication. So as it relates to the disenfranchisement of misinformation, disinformation, and rights restoration, it's important for elected officials like Assemblyman Lavine to share his grandfather's story, right? To share that if his grandfather tried to vote 20 years ago, if he was alive or if he's still alive, he would not be able to vote. He would be deemed ineligible. That right there is a powerful story, in that he wouldn't be able to vote for his own grandson. We all know that we are not our worst mistake. And in New York State, we believe in rehabilitation. So if we believe in rehabilitation and we believe in inclusiveness, then why are we creating barriers that we understand have no correlation to someone's ability to participate in our democracy? And I shared my story in the beginning because I think it's important for individuals to see the collateral consequences of how just preventing people in a certain community from engaging in the system can have a young boy thinking that this system isn't meant for me. And no one's family should bear the burden of ensuring that their kids understand that this system is for them and that this country is inclusive of them. So what we're doing at Advancement Projects National Office is, one, we're calling for a restoration of rights broadly, right? So certainly we're calling for a constitutional amendment so that way it's codified in the US Constitution, which is not, but as it relates to the state of New York, is making sure that individuals who have a story are comfortable sharing their story, understanding how things are done, and making sure that we understand that democracy is a learned experience and that all citizens deserve an opportunity to participate in our democracy.
Jorge, thank you so much. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate how you connected it to the story that Assemblymember Lavine shared as well. I'm hearing from a source that potentially this AVR bill might have been sent to the governor. And so we may have news before the end of the year. So we'll all be staying tuned to that. I want to go back to the conversation about the state's new campaign finance system. And Doug, some of what you were alluding to in terms of the work that needs to be done to get that system in place in time for 2022 so it can be administered in 2024. And I wonder if Ciara wants to weigh in at all in terms of some of the work that you're going to talk about, and how to make it, keeping in mind the comments we've heard from all of them. This is a system that's intended, I guess, to be candidate centered. So how to make it something that is also user friendly. So Doug, can you tell us a little bit more about what needs to happen?
Well, those are very important things. And, you know, we're off to a little bit of a slow start because the governor has not yet appointed his commissioner to the Public Campaign Finance Commission, and the Senate and Assembly Republicans have not made their appointments yet. We got a great commissioner from the Senate and Assembly Democrats in Professor Echo Yanka, who has been trying to engage on these things. But we need to get in place now the regulations for the system. And there are a lot of details that have to be addressed in those regulations that are not contained in the statute. And then we need to have a computer system that's completely set up and functional by the start of the cycle immediately following the elections in November 2022. So that's less than 2 years away. And we're developing a computer system that needs to be user-friendly from scratch. And it took the City Campaign Finance Board, which has a good system, years to get all their tweaks done. And we haven't started yet. Hopefully this will be addressed in the budget that is adopted in April of 2021. So that is, together with the appointment of the 2 missing commissioners and getting this item in the budget that will be adopted to begin April 2021 are key thresholds to making this system work.
I would endorse all of that. I would say that New York State should do what New York State does best, which is the brain drain, that you have experts on how to run a public funds matching system in New York City, get some of those good brains working for the state. You also have the neighboring state of Connecticut, which has had a public financing system for a few years now. You know, get some of those people to move back to the city or back to the state and use their brain power for the public good.
Doug and Ciara, in terms of how this campaign finance system will work for the state, does it demand the establishment of a state campaign finance board separate from the state board of elections, similar to what we have in New York City?
No, the 4 state board commissioners are members of the Public Campaign Finance Commission, which altogether is 7 commissioners. And the program will be run within the structure of the State Board of Elections. But the staffing for this program will probably be 2 or 3 times the number of employees who currently work at the State Board of Elections. I anticipate that there'll be a separate director of that program who will report to the 7 commissioners. And for the time being, the personnel at the State Board are working on setting it up. But you have to keep in mind, the State Board of Elections is a very small agency. We're talking, we already handle the campaign finance disclosure system, which is about half of the employees of the state board. And I believe our total head count now is about 45 or 50. So, we're going to be going from that. We think we need at least 100 to run the state board system. And the state campaign finance system is going to be much more complex and have more contests than the city campaign finance board system handles. So that it's not exactly the same. And it's not as if you can just take the computer system that the city campaign finance board has and set it up for Albany. Although people are certainly looking at just how to take as much as what the city has already and not have to reinvent the wheel to do that. And one thing that people may not realize is that we've been working now I think for 8 years on the new campaign finance disclosure system, and that is going to go live next month. But it took 8 years to get that system done, mainly because of funding problems where continual budget freezes. And so developing these new systems is not easy. And as I said, the major project we're working on now, besides rolling out the campaign finance disclosure system, is a new voter registration system that will also, an online voter registration system that will also include an absentee ballot tracking system. And that is in progress. It got delayed. The governor froze the budget for that 1 week after the legislature adopted the budget. And fortunately, a phone call from Senator Krueger, who is the Senate Finance Chair, to the governor's office, got it unfrozen shortly after the primary election, when we pointed out that this absentee ballot tracking system that they wanted and the online voter application system had been frozen by them. And finally, they unfroze.
Thanks, Doug. We're coming near our end, but I wanted to go back to a point that Professor Tolson made in terms of the need for more civic education, that where the lack of information is filled by misinformation. And I wonder if, Professor Tolson, if you want to talk a little bit more about our truth problem, but then also to Senator Myrie in terms of, in addition to looking at reforms for our election system, do you anticipate or, would you be pushing your colleagues to also invest in more civic education so that people better understand how to be active citizens because they understand these processes?
So I'm a big fan of public education. It has worked. So examples that come to mind is in Pennsylvania, the issue with the naked ballots, right? That there was an intense public education campaign to let people know that you have to put your ballot in the secrecy envelope and then in the mailing envelope, also will be discarded, right? So it made a huge difference. Another example was when Arizona passed this proof of citizenship requirement to register to vote. There was a public education campaign in order to inform people about what they needed in order to register to vote. Now, of course, that law is dumb, but at least voters knew what they needed to do in order to comply with it. So public education works. And if anything, the last 4 years in particular have revealed that a lot of people aren't clear on how our system of elections work. And part of it is that in the last 2 decades, the levels of polarization have increased substantially such that elections are more contested and people are more invested in the election outcome, even if they don't understand how the election process works. And so, in part, the misinformation that has come out in recent years is a product of that, right? It is an attempt to confuse people so that they will think that our elections work one way when in effect they work another way. And also is the fact that we have misinformation coming from sources that are usually supposed to be trusted. our elected officials are supposed to be trusted sources of information, even though, and this is of course different from politicians, running for office saying certain things. When people are in elected positions, people look to them as sources of truth. I mean, you can't really do that anymore. And so because our traditional sources are not as reliable as they used to be, it becomes really important for people to be able to draw on trusted sources for information. And part of that is having a repository of of information that people know. And this comes down to civic education. A lot of people have not had a civics class since probably high school. And I don't even know if high schools require civics anymore. They did when I was in high school, but that was 5 years ago. Long story short, it has become really imperative for people to have a knowledge base to draw on, independent of what's going on around them, right? So that we don't have these issues of sources that used to be trusted being able to peddle misinformation in order to confuse people and alter the election outcome.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Professor Tolson more. I think this is sort of most highlighted in the nature of our president's rhetoric, in that he embodied the "don't think of an elephant" phrase, right? It doesn't matter whether or not this is true, whether or not this has any relationship to reality. You're now thinking of an elephant simply because he said it, and the discrediting of our democracy, I think, has been part of his branding, but it also has trickled down all the way here to New York. We have New York Congress members that have called into question the results of our elections. And this, to me, is sort of the most corrosive effect of what this president has said, is that he has normalized this sort of hyperbole and just straight up falsehoods. So on the civic education piece, I think it's imperative not only that we do it, but that we start it early. I don't use the arithmetic that I learned in middle school. I don't use pre-calculus or calculus in my day-to-day life. It would have been great to know when I was in high school who my assembly member was, who my state senator was, who my council member was, and why they were important. And I think that requiring that in the curriculum is something that we should be looking towards, codifying in the law. We did pass in 2019 the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And we actually got to see that play out in real time. I went to one of my high schools in my district, and we had a voter registration drive for our juniors and our seniors. And we registered like 100 kids who, were now don't have to worry about it. When you turn 18, you're automatically done. And they were excited about it and engaged in it. And we know that once you vote early, you're going to be a voter consistently for the rest of your life. And so, I'm a huge proponent of that and think we need to be doing more of it.
Senator, thank you so much. And I just want to thank all the panelists for your presentations, for your great insights, for taking my follow-up calls when I reach out to you for my stories going forward, because I'm calling all of you. I really appreciate it. It was really interesting. I could geek out on this for a long time. And so I also want to thank our 100 or so participants who've stuck around for these 2 hours, and to Catherine for this opportunity to moderate this conversation. It was really, really interesting, really a blast. I'll be watching the status of that automatic voter registration between now and December 23rd. So thank you, everybody. And I will turn it back over to Catherine.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to all of our speakers and to our co-sponsors and to the New York City Bar Association. Let's continue to do this work together. Thank you. Good night.